Making her way with the guards, Nina knew this man was going to be killing her for the second time. The second prince reminded her that deception against the crown was a serious crime. She uttered, "I know," but wished for him to look at her one last time. In town, we hear a woman screaming for someone to catch a thief, and see Nina running as fast as she could, hopping over a ledge down to her brother, Saji. They avoided the man chasing after her, and made it back to their home where Colin was waiting. The two had to do what they could for Colin since he was weak, and they scored big. The three truly lived hand to mouth, occasionally stealing valuables from the wealthy to scrape by. There was a plague 5 years ago that claimed a lot of lives. After losing their families, they did whatever was necessary to survive. Saji and Colin had each other at first, but then Nina completed their little group. Digging through the spoils, Colin presented a bracelet containing a lapis lazuli gem, a beautiful blue, just like Nina's eyes, much like the sky before dawn. However, the compliments really embarrassed her. When Colin mentioned it was a shame she had to hide her eyes all the time, Saji called him stupid, because the slavers would be after her if she didn't. You don't see eyes like hers every day. They're so rare, a lot of rich folk would do anything to own them. The three were always hungry and never had any money, but their way of life was pleasant enough for Nina. Saji called her cooking so bad it should be illegal, and with Colin happily agreeing, she told them to shut up. They made things work, sharing fun and laughter. But now, she only thought, silly me, for thinking those days would last forever. One day, Colin's fever got so bad, Saji believed he wouldn't make it. Nina shouted they could still see a doctor. It wasn't over until it was over. However, Saji countered, "Sure! And where will we get the money for that?" Nina was taken aback, knowing the platitude was worthless. Saji knew it was over, all written in the stars. The poor are born under a poor star, and the rich are born under a rich star. It's all decided the moment you're born. Nina tried to challenge this. She believed someday they could change things, but Saji told her to forget someday, because Colin probably wouldn't even live to see the sunrise tomorrow. He shouted that she could only talk about someday because she wasn't family, she was an outsider. Nina shook, hurt from his words, defiantly shouting back that she'd figure something out, then stormed out. But quickly, she was getting beaten for stealing earlier. She now realized she was an idiot, because with Colin being his real brother, this had to be much harder on Saji. Afterwards, she stared at her bruised reflection in some water, thinking about how no one had eyes like hers. She began to tear up, feeling truly alone. As the rain poured, she cried with desires to be special to at least one person in this world. Elsewhere, Azure and Didas discovered Princess Alicia's carriage had fallen and crashed over a cliff. Seeing no one survived, Azure explained they would keep this a secret, and they would find a stand-in as quickly as possible. The next day, visiting the graves of their families, Saji apologized to Nina for yelling at her. She accepted and apologized too, for some reason making him nervous. But he looked away and told her there was somewhere special he wanted to take her. They arrived at an empty house, where Saji told her he and his brother couldn't keep living like this. Wanting to get out of this dead end, this was the only option. Suddenly, the door barged open with 2 cloaked men. Saji apologized as he left, and Nina's eyes widened, believing he sold her to slavers. Trying to escape their grasp, she slammed into the wall and fell over. Azure told Didas to be gentle with him, referring to Nina. She lied on the floor, crying, not understanding why Saji would do this to her. Was he angry with her? Or was she just an outsider to him this entire time? Her heart hurt so much. Azure then pulled her hair over to check her eyes, seeing the deep blue he was looking for, while she fixated on his golden eyes, comparing them to the eyes of a beast. Azure remarked, "The boy's stench was awful and filthy." He commanded Didas to take the boy's clothes off, and she struggled, trying to run off, until Azure accidentally ripped her clothing off, and now she was topless and blushing. The two men were stunned, wondering why she was masquerading as a boy. Didas concluded if slavers knew she was a girl, they definitely would have hunted her down. But now Azure figured this would work perfectly for their plans. They wouldn't need to disguise a boy. This could now be more than a temporary stopgap. He kneeled down to her level and told Nina today she'd die and then live as a princess. But I won't live unless you like this video and subscribe to my channel. Please, don't make me become a beggar on the street. Because here on my Shoujo Weekly, the streets know I've got plenty of fun stories involving action, involving drama, involving handsome princes. I also live stream weekly, where I talk about interesting anime topics and play games with you. So come on, give me that sub, I'll be your plug. Inside her new residence, the court ladies told Nina to wait, but she told them she wasn't going to wait just because they said so, only to trip on her new dress. Prince Azure Seth Fortna arrived, commenting on the commotion, and with Nina getting up, his mouth dropped, shocked seeing how different the filthy boy they brought here looked now. She quickly got up to point, calling Azure Mr. Golden Eyes. He then sighed, because even with lovely clothes, this girl was still the same on the inside. She continued to shout at him, so he put his blade on her shoulder and told her to kneel. She was not permitted to talk back. From this moment on, her new identity was Alicia Seth Fortna, this country's priestess princess, the very heart of their proud nation who possessed eyes of lapis lazuli, like the god of the stars. For the next 3 months, she would learn to act like a princess and dress the part. After that, she would marry the crown prince set to ascend the throne of Galgada. That's it. This deception must never be discovered. Nina then suddenly kicked the sword out of Azure's hand and caught it, pointing the hilt at the prince's direction. She felt there was no point in being afraid. She had nothing left to lose. She told him not to forget he was asking her for a favor, but he wondered why she was pointing the hilt at him. Glossing over the silly position she put herself in, she told him to fix his attitude and reveal his identity. Otherwise, she was out of here. He sneered a bit, asking if a peasant like her had a home to return to. But he saw her crudely made point, and begged her to forgive his prior rudeness. Certainly a surprise for her. Azure then rephrased what he said earlier. For the next 3 months, he'd be her tutor and she could think of him as her master in training. This is when he introduced himself as the Kingdom of Fortna's second prince. Later, he would teach her how to speak properly, trying to correct her country/commoner mannerisms of speaking. She got annoyed, having to repeat the same things over and over all morning. He asked her to explain her annoyed expression, to which she responded she couldn't learn all of these things at once, especially with the fact she also couldn't read or write. Azure knew this, which is why he was having her practice through repetition. They needed to hurry because in 3 days' time, she'd have an audience with the king. Nina was now getting nervous, worried the king would figure out she was a substitute. She asked him if she really looked like Alicia, to which the court ladies remarked, not at all. The only similarity they shared were the color of their eyes. Princess Alicia was the daughter of the late third queen. and since she was chosen to succeed the astral priestess shortly after birth, she was raised in the astral villa. The debut of a new priestess takes place at the first star festival after she turned 16. Nina remembered her parents telling her the hanging lights were the hopes of people that the astral priestess prayed to be fulfilled. She had those times with her parents when she was young, but last year she was with Saji and Colin. Until the star festival after her 16th birthday, the priestess was not permitted to leave the astral villa, meaning very few people apart from her attendants would have ever seen her face. Before the princess turned 16, she was to return to secular life so she could marry. Nina didn't quite understand everything, but either way, Azure would reward her success. The court ladies then begged her to go along with this charade, so Nina accepted, asking them to stop groveling. Prince Goldie hissed Nina off. However, she felt bad for these court ladies. But these next days of training were so hard for her. She hated it. She wanted to quit, getting dramatic, telling them she was going to die. One of the court ladies suggested they take a break, so Azure took her out for some fresh air, where her eyes glimmered. She had been cooped up the whole time, but was now seeing that she really was at the royal palace. As the breeze blew by, she noticed the nice smell coming from Azure. She wondered if all nobles had such a pleasant scent. She bet they were born that way, not like bottom dwellers like her. She thought he was so important, normally they'd never even set foot on the same ground. She wondered how she even got here. Azure then turned towards her and said, "I truly need you for the sake of my dear country." Nina took this in. She was needed. Someone needed her. That was enough to make her stay. On the third day, Nina marveled over her outfit she was seeing the king in. The court ladies called her beautiful. That being said, they still needed her to do her best. This has to go well. If they discover Nina is an imposter, all their heads would be swiftly severed from their bodies. In front of the throne room, they announced the arrival of Princess Alicia. Nina walked in, feeling the intensity of all this. She bowed in front of the king and queen, eyebrows shaking as she tried to hold it together. The king told her there was no need for his own daughter to be so nervous, and had her raise her head. She raised slowly, now seeing the king and queen before her own eyes. The king was wowed, seeing those piercingly blue eyes, remarking no other hue could compare to their beauty. He then apologized for beckoning her here on a whim. She responded that there was no trouble at all, and that she was simply pleased to be of service. The king smiled at her, saying once again there was no need for her to be so stiff. He was happy his daughter was home, and applauded her half-brother Azure for looking after her from this point on until the day she was married. The queen scoffed, however, mentioning the astral priestess traditionally performs a dance for the crowned prince's coming-of-age ceremony. She suggested Nina perform it for their son, Prince Muhulam. This might be their only chance to see it, after all. This made Nina extremely nervous because she knew nothing of the dance. The king then brought up that Muhulam was still many years away from coming of age, but the queen insisted, even so, the dance would be entertaining, especially since Alicia has been training for 15 years. Would it not be a waste to send her off without having seen a single dance? Some men in the back spoke in hushed whispers over the queen's cruelty streak. They knew it was her display of power over Prince Azure. Nina was at a loss, knowing she couldn't fake this. Luckily, Azure butt in, reminding them that the princess hasn't come of age, nor has she assumed her religious duties. Were she to dance in her unqualified state, it would bring misfortune to Prince Muhulam's future. Not only that, but Muhulam wasn't even present, since he was bedridden in his chamber. With the king accepting Azure's answer, Azure called this meeting adjourned. since it also seemed like Alicia was unwell. Walking out with him, Nina thought the whole thing was a complete failure. Even if her secret was safe, she felt she let the prince down. She laid in bed, thinking someone like her didn't belong in such a majestic place as this. She thought this was enough. Goldie wasn't worth risking her life over, and none of this was really her problem anyhow. She was thinking of running away, but remembering Saji abandoned her, what home did she have to go back to? Nina then overheard the Queen and Azure speaking outside. The Queen questioned what authority he had that prevented her from moving Princess Alicia to her wing. She told him the God of Stars had control over fate itself, since he was so insistent on caring for the astral priestess. She questioned if he mistakenly believed he was the rightful heir to the throne. He responded otherwise though, assuring his only desire was to support this country to the best of his ability. Remembering how Azure told her he needed her for his dear country, Nina's eyes glimmered. We then hear the Queen calling Azure's mother, the king's former wife, a weak-willed woman, timid and fearful. Saying he could learn a thing or two from his mother, the Queen tossed her fan into the water next to them. She then gave the fakest gasp, telling him her fan falling was his fault, and told him to go fetch it, making Nina gasp, wondering what the Queen's problem was. Nina then quickly jumped into the water, splashing it all over the Queen, pulling the fan out and presenting it to her. The Queen was pissed, getting ready to smack Nina, and as Nina shuddered back, Azure stood in the way, telling the Queen it was a most pleasant day for a little dip. The Queen began to scream, and her court ladies had to hold her back and get her away. Nina apologized to Azure, saying the Queen was so awful, she felt like she had to do this. Azure then quickly pulled her along until they were somewhere private. Nina apologized once again, but seeing Azure shake, she wondered if he was mad. Turns out, he was just laughing. Azure predicted the outcome back in the throne room. Since the Queen was such a wicked person, everything went according to plan, so he offered Nina her reward. She thought about it, and taking off her wig, she told the prince to praise her. She really wanted him to praise her and make it feel special. He thought she must be joking. However, the court lady could tell Nina was lonely. So, Azure threw a towel over her head, and placing his hand on top, he said, "You did well. I'm proud of you," making her smile. Fortna's Star Festival is a wheat festival held early in the summer. The people offer thanks and prayers to the God of Stars and hang lanterns from the doors of their homes, one per person, as each one makes a wish. Princess Alicia is resting apparently from a headache. The court ladies decided to keep the door closed so she couldn't leave on her own, but she snuck out, wondering what was wrong with her walking around a little. Was it that villainous golden-eyed prince's decision? A little boy who spotted her called her a thief, but seeing her eyes, he realized it was his sister, making her fall. This is when he introduced himself as the first prince of Fortna, Mushulam Seth Fortna. Nina could hardly believe this little boy was ranked higher than his older brother. However, he was willing to escort her wherever she wanted to go. With him being the next king, he knew where everything was. Since that was the case, she wanted something she could use against Goldie. Elsewhere, we see Azure defeating one of his soldiers in an exhibitionary duel. Mushulam surmised his big brother must be strong so that he could be protected. They then overhear the soldiers talk about how sickly Mushulam is, and how he hates swordplay, and how he's nothing like Prince Azure. Mushulam copes with this by declaring a king to not need such skills, especially since his brother could have it for him. Nina understood there must be a lot of pressure on this little boy, and told him they should keep looking for things to beat Azure with. Escorting him forward, she suddenly stopped, sensing someone was following them. must have been her imagination, since she couldn't see anyone. They snuck into Azure's room, which was filled with various items from other places. Mulhulum praised his big brother's accomplishments because at 17, Azure was already leading a regiment. They then suddenly heard Azure approaching and went to hide. But Azure quickly found Nina hiding under the sheets and pulled her out. Of course, he easily spotted Mulhulum hiding outside, referring to him as Your Highness. Mulhulum then told his big brother to be silent, invoking his I'm the next king card. But it was that very reason Azure reminded him to think before he acted. He had heard Mulhulum was skipping his swordplay lessons too. Mulhulum challenged this, telling Azure to become a king instead if he thought himself to be a better fit, then ran off. Nina told Azure he should listen to how his little brother feels more, and then she started running after the young prince. Mulhulum climbed on top of an area where the wood beneath him broke, and Nina jumped after him. As the time passed, she held the little boy close, telling him they were supposed to do this when it got cold, just until help arrived at least. The boy was not confident help would come for them though. Maybe his mother was tearing the place apart for him, but he felt everyone else thought Azure should be the first prince. Nina contemplated this idea. Perhaps being a prince was harder than she thought. There were probably people constantly telling Mulhulum what to do and putting a lot of ideas in his head. She thought things should be simpler. With a smile, she told Mulhulum he loved his brother and admired him for leading a regiment and wanted to be like him. Mulhulum struggled a bit, trying to deny it, but ultimately nodded. So, Nina suggested he go ask Azure to teach him himself. That way, Mulhulum could become a better king. And if Azure wouldn't listen, she suggested they just blackmail him. They had new problems. The water beneath them was rising, despite the fact this place should have dried up long ago. They then noticed a bubbling beneath, and started freaking out, screaming for help. When nightfall came, Mulhulum apologized while climbing atop his sister for him being so plump. Hearing him scream for help in her ear, she wondered how this all happened. Oh, that's right, Goldie. Wasn't she his important substitute? She wanted him to hurry up and rescue her. That's when she screamed, Azure, you idiot, scumbag, dolt, I bet you have an Audi. Now just arriving to their rescue, he questioned what she meant by that. After getting the prince out, Nina was too cold to move, so Azure pulled her out himself, telling her to put her arms around his neck, since she was throwing him off balance. He acknowledged the water must have been very cold, and thanked Nina for helping his little brother. This small thank you made Azure shine in Nina's eyes. She felt his warmth. She knew he wasn't a bad guy. After all, the little prince adored him. Outside, Mulhulum squeaked, asking Azure to teach him how to use a sword sometime. Azure was certainly surprised, but accepted, albeit he proclaimed himself to be a tough teacher. This lit little Mulhulum up. With the first prince taking his leave, Azure expressed his lack of understanding. He thought the first prince was avoiding him, but Nina understood people won't understand how you feel unless you tell them. Walking back, she asked if Azure had any weaknesses, claiming the knowledge would help boost Mulhulum's confidence. On the inside, though, she just wanted blackmail material. His answer was formless things, but Nina had no idea what that meant. She then used all of her brain power to surmise it was ghosts, but he dismissed the idea. However, watching them in secret, two men discussed the idea that Princess Alicia was dead. They just didn't have proof yet. They questioned who this girl was that had the lapis lazuli eyes. Later, she stretched in her room, remarking it to be the only place she could relax. But Azure told her there was no place for relaxation. since she must naturally be Alicia no matter where she was. He wasn't going to let her out on her own anytime soon. She countered by telling Az he was afraid of ghosts. He easily fended her off, telling her she complained like a child. The court ladies found it heartwarming that the two had grown so close. However, the two suggested the idea of them getting close at all to be ridiculous. But then Didas chimed in, saying only she was allowed to speak to Azure with such casualness. Making their way, Nina was worried about the Star Festival happening soon, wondering if she'd have to dance as the Astral Priestess. Azure had assured, though, that she'd have no role to play now that she was secularized. A great relief to her. He then handed her a lantern, since royals were also permitted to make wishes. It scared her a little to see him act so nice. The king and his entourage arrived, calling out to them, and the queen tells Azure, "I hope you're not wishing for the throne." Ugh, so damn pretentious. The king played nice, however, telling her his son was a sensible second prince. He then mentioned it to be a shame they wouldn't be able to see Alicia perform rituals as a priestess. But fortunately, this meant she'd be able to enjoy the festival herself. Man, she loved how nice the king was to her. But with one of the advisors asking for her to dance at least once, she got irritated. Taking off, Nina brought up how the queen was as nasty as ever. However, Azure didn't dislike her at all. In fact, he felt positively towards her since she was straightforward and only attacked head-on. In any case, he didn't feel everyone was as simple as Nina. Nina took this as an insult, but he thought of his statement as a compliment. Nearly dropping her lantern, she wondered why he didn't grab one, to which he responded he had nothing to wish for. Nina wondered if it was because he wanted nothing or because his wishes had already come true. With Nina meeting Muhilem, he expressed wishing the Star Festival hadn't come. As Nina began munching on his snacks, she asked if it was because he was sickly all the time. He then expressed he was fine now, only that he was still here because his mother wanted him to rest. He was just saddened knowing a month and a half after the festival ends, his sister would be leaving and getting married. She'd be going to Galgada, a neighboring kingdom beyond steep mountains. It had a long route by both land and sea. It takes weeks to get there. It used to be a small kingdom far to the north, but in the past few decades, they moved swiftly south. And Muhilem has heard their prince was quite a scary person. He was worried, and thought of wishing for Nina to not get married. She then hugged the little prince for being so cute. Afterwards, Nina thought about the distance of living in the kingdom of Galgada. The only thing she was truly sad about was that she might never see Azure again. Then suddenly, the advisor from earlier came by, mentioning she must have never seen the Star Festival before, given her time being secluded. He then gave her advice on how she could sneak out to see it, while everyone else was eating, before taking off himself. The court ladies came running to her side, reminding her she shouldn't be by herself, asking who that man was. In her room, she sat in a daze, just thinking. She didn't think she could go outside, but wondered what she would do if she did. While Nina made her way to sneak out in the evening, we hear the monologue of a man talking of a blue-eyed orphan who used to be around the same age as Princess Alicia. The Astral Villa staff were known to be tight-lipped and wouldn't say a word. The former king, the current king's father, was ill and practically powerless. This man was going to use this opportunity to make a move. Azure found out Nina was missing. The court ladies discussed Nina learning where the priest's robes were within the temple, and that also the temple leads directly out to the city. She actually made it out of the palace. She started to stroll about, imagining her parents' voices welcoming her home. She remembered when her parents told her she had the same kind of blue eyes as the god of stars, and that she needed to keep them hidden until she was grown. She then remembered the warmth she felt being with Colin and Saji, the lantern they shared, the wishes they made. She returned to her old home, but found neither of the brothers there. If they were gone, the existence of Nina would completely vanish as well. She suddenly got jump-scared with Prince Azure finding her, then started beating and blaming him for her previous family being gone. Tears running down her face, she remembered when Azure said she'd die. She thought it was just a figure of speech at the time when he said she was going to be reborn as a princess. But now she realized the Nina she's lived as would truly disappear. She'd be sent to a faraway country, and everyone who knew Nina would be gone. No, she realized Nina was already dead, since there's no one left to call her that. Azure thought of his own past, the names and faces of his parents he couldn't remember, and the day he was declared to be Azure Seth Fortuna, replacing the true dead prince. Just like Nina, a man told him he'd have to create a new version of himself. Snapping out of his thoughts, he quickly tossed a knife at a man pursuing them, and went outside slaying 2 men, pointing his blade at the one cowering. Oh no, another man caught Nina! But still, Azure was vigilant, cutting down the man trying to sneak up on him. Nina was able to get away by slipping out of her wig, and from there, Azure held her close, cutting down one assailant after another, with the last one being one of the king's advisors. But now, the advisor was able to see Nina was in fact a fake princess. Azure had no need to ask what the man's intentions were though, since the dead couldn't speak. The man screamed Azure was a usurper, but inevitably was cut down, meeting his end. Nina was shaken from all this, but noticed blood dripping down Azure's hand. She took it as her fault, even though he didn't blame her. He knew, though, that many in the palace were offended by his existence. Their goal was to remove him. He sat down to rest, telling Nina she could flee someplace far now if she wanted. She wondered if he was saying this because of what she said earlier. She wrapped a part of her dress around his injured arm, asking if he still needed her, and since he said yes, she told him not to worry about what she said earlier, claiming she was just lashing out. And there wasn't anyone who could call her Nina left anyway. She kept thinking about Azure saying he needed her. Out of respect for those words, she chose to forgive him, and now told him, "I'll die for you." His eyes widened hearing this. He quickly got up, acknowledging he knew she wasn't Alicia. He then brought her in close for a hug, and facing her eye to eye, he called her Nina, and told her that's what he'd call her when they were alone. Tears welled up in her eyes. If there was one wish she wanted to make to the god of stars, she only wished for at least one person to need her. Remembering she'd be leaving in a month and a half, it left a pain in her chest. The day Nina was called by her name again, she found a place where she belonged. She had no family, but he said he needed her. Riding a horse one day, Azure commented Nina learned quickly when she didn't have to use her head. She was joyous playing outside, but now wondered if she was just being bad-mouthed, reminding her it was dangerous for her to be outside. She wondered if he was talking about what happened the other day. She assumed the men attacking them were servants of the queen. Did they attack because the queen thought Azure wanted the throne? Hearing Didas left them to go return the horse, she looked around, then grabbed at Azure's shirt, telling him since no one was here, she wanted him to call her Nina. He did, with hesitation, making her smile. Hearing her name made her feel warm and fuzzy. She hated Azure until recently, but she was glad at least one person knew who she was. Later, we see Nina staring at a fita. It's apparently a protective charm that's popular amongst court ladies. They're said to be woven with wishes and prayers. Apparently, the court ladies primarily make them with the one they love in mind. Imagining Azure, Nina began to panic, trying to convince herself Azure was simply a man who called her by her real name, not a romantic interest. She's getting married anyway, which, by the way, made her depressed. The next day, Azure decided to take her out for a long ride, since her court ladies said she needed a change of pace. She ran to her horse, and looking at his, Azure could tell his saddle had been tampered with. Instead of telling Nina, though, he made the excuse that he was worried about letting her ride alone, so they rode together on Didas's horse. And whoa, she was not ready for all this. With him telling her to scoot closer, she smashed her head into his chin in panic. She marveled over the large seeable distance point and noticed a place with a red roof. Azure described that as the royal villa. It's where the former king lives now. He is their great-grandfather and had built the foundation of this nation's prosperity. In simple terms, he was far more important than the current king. When Azure was 4, his great-grandfather taught him all kinds of things for a decade. Nina noted this to be the first time Azure had spoken about himself. Perhaps his great-grandfather was important to him. She then wondered what Azure thought of her, and thought of him as someone important to her. After finishing her fita, Nina decided to sneak to Azure's room. She was about to enter, but stopped herself to overhear Didas explain Azure's horse saddle was in fact compromised, and had he ridden, he could have been in danger. The danger was increasing day by day. Didas felt they should put up extra measures to protect Prince Azure. Maybe ask the king for help. However, Azure said there was no need. He preferred for it not to happen right away, but if it was for the sake of the nation, he'd allow himself to be eliminated. That's the star he was born under. Nina felt an ache in her heart. She hated this whole born under the stars nonsense. She barged in, scolding him for being okay with dying. But Azure reiterated he didn't mind, claiming his life was far less valuable than she thought. She began to tear up, screaming at him, and when he told Nina she merely needed to fulfill her role, she threw her fita at him, shouting he wasn't supposed to call her that when they weren't alone together. But when she took off, he noticed the charm. At the main palace, she was still fuming over how stupid Azure was being. Then, the king appeared to greet her. She thought this was her chance to ask him for help. He heard she retired early because she felt unwell on the day of the Star Festival, which made sense because he did not know about what transpired that night. Since she suspects it to be the Queen's doing, she couldn't tell him. He let her know she could come to him if she ever needed help, but she knew she couldn't depend on him. She wondered if there was someone else powerful enough to help Azure, and then it came to her. By horse, she knew it's a half-day's round trip to the former king's villa. She suddenly fell off, creating a loud thud on the ground. However, her horse turned around for her and she got right back on. Even though Azure told her not to do anything, she didn't want to lose anyone anymore. The old king was surprised to see she had come without an appointment. She then introduced herself and begged him to help Prince Azure. She recounted the events that happened during the Star Festival, then the tampered horse's reins. She explained the current queen may have done it, believing Prince Azure wanted to usurp the throne. The old king was certain Azure said nothing about the queen's actions, since that's exactly how he was raised. He commented on Azure's talent, because every time he'd teach him one thing, Azure would understand 10. He was raised to be this nation's cornerstone, which meant if he was doing nothing, that's because he believed it to be the best course of action. Nina pleaded for the old king to save Azure, but instead, He told her to come closer. Seeing her stepping on a particular tile, he called her out for not being Alicia, and then called his guards for her capture. He knew someone raised in the astral villa would never tread upon the star crest. He wanted this imposter to be stripped and thrown in the dungeon. In bed later, he asked if Princess Alicia was miserable, only to learn she was peacefully humming in her cell, since this wasn't too different from her old home. Regardless, she needed to remain amicable. That way the others would be forgiven. She then began to happily clean her cell. For what purpose? The guards had no idea. The old king then had one of the guards go to threaten her, and hearing she'd be flogged 100 times tomorrow, she responded in joy, because at least she wasn't being beheaded. Seeing her the next day, he was surprised to learn she slept like a rock. She then began to plead for Prince Azure's saving once again. She apologized for deceiving the old king and accepted any due punishment. She be sacrificed since her court ladies were good people. The prince and his entourage gave her a place to belong. She told the old king once people lived together, that made them family. He took note of those words, but explained he had no power to save Azure. His legs have withered and he could no longer move. Eventually, the poison would spread throughout his body and stop his heart. He was dying, but he knew Alicia could do something. He explained the power of her position. It was his grandson, the current king, who easily agreed to her engagement with Galgada. That was what started all of this. Galgada wanted an excuse to invade Fortna, despite their friendly relations. So they demanded Fortna's priestess princess. If they refused, Galgada could have invaded due to dissolution of friendship. And even if she did marry, they'd likely find some other fault to invade over. However, he believed Alicia controlled the fate of Fortna. If she had the resolve and determination, she could protect Azure. Outside the door, though, they heard someone breaking in. It was Prince Azure, panting and sweating. He quickly took the blame himself, saying he planned all of it and that Nina was innocent. But the old king told him that was enough, because he's figured out the situation, and only his 2 most trusted guards knew about it. No one else would find out. He wanted Azure and Nina to rest here tonight and return home tomorrow. Azure was surprised. However, the old king remarked he hadn't had this much fun in a while. Azure gave a slight smile in response, before the two took their leave. Afterwards, the old king had Didas come forward, saying the impostor princess was peculiar, but would likely become the wind that moves Azure. Staring at the western horizon that evening, Azure had always loved it here. He wished Nina had at least left a note saying if she was going to go somewhere. She pointed, seeing his golden eyes just like his great-grandfather's. She knew he didn't look anything like the king, but now sees he had taken after his great-grandfather. Azure then opened up about how he had no royal blood in his veins. Like Nina, he was a substitute for a dead prince. This truth was a huge surprise for her. We learned when he was young, he was swapped for the real prince who died of an illness. Only the king, the former king, and a handful of others knew. Not even the current queen knew about this. One of the advisors helped plan this, since the prince was only 4. If they kept this Azure out of the public, a few years from now, no one would notice any changes to his appearance. The old king decided to raise him at the villa. He raised Azure to live for the nation and give everything he had for it, and that he must neither wish for nor desire anything else. Azure's fate was decided for him with those 10 years of teachings, and Azure gave quite a royal air about him. Then, when Muhulin was born, the king made Azure the second prince. one whose purpose was to support the nation as the future king's advisor. He knew they could have eliminated him as soon as Mushulum was born. He was a pawn. That's not the reason why, but he also saw others as pawns. Initially, Nina as well. He wanted a substitute for Alicia with the intention of killing them. This sub was supposed to die before they were discovered in Galgata. It was the best way to prevent Galgata finding an excuse to invade. However, he didn't see Nina as a pawn. Since the other day, he's been wondering what he'd do if anything were to happen to her. He didn't want to lose her tearful smile. He told her there was no one like her, and he wouldn't let her die. She then shouted she wouldn't let him die either. She didn't care if he wasn't the real prince. He could still support the nation. If he died, there wouldn't be anyone else who called her Nina. Although he responded she could just have Didas and her ladies-in-waiting say her real name. She told him no. She wanted him to call her that. It had to be him, or it was meaningless to her. She didn't care if he wasn't a prince. He was the only one for her. Azure paused, seeing those beautiful blue eyes, blue like the dawn. Those honest eyes weren't looking at a prince or anyone else. His life was empty. He wanted nothing, but now found himself kissing her. Realizing what he did, he pulled himself away and covered her eyes, telling her it was just a dream. He wished her a good night, and she lied in her bed, giddy, knowing it wasn't a dream. On another morning, Nina was in awe seeing the gifts Galgata sent as dowry. She first looked at the shatar pieces, which seemed quite expensive. Placing the shawl over her head, the maids thought she looked just like a bride. However, Prince Azure told them not to touch any of the gifts, as they may have to return them. Staring at him, Nina became flustered, remembering the kiss. Hearing him say the shawl didn't suit her, she took it off quickly. Then, he placed a pin in her hair, telling her not to wear the Galgatan clothing. He gave her the pin in return for the fita she made him, and said the blue made her look lovely. Oh my gosh, her heart couldn't handle his sweet talk. She thanked him with a bit of franticness, causing him to laugh over it. He then informed her he was sending a messenger to Galgata to negotiate the dissolution of her engagement. She was surprised, however. He wanted her to stay forever. In her heart, she would be so happy if she could stay with Azure. She thought there was still one problem that hadn't been resolved, though. They still didn't know who was trying to kill Oz. Remembering the old king telling her Alicia could protect the kingdom, she still couldn't comprehend what he meant. But since she was the only one who could handle this, she decided to do her best. Spending time with Mushulum, he brought up all the gifts she received, but now mentioned her troubled looks, saying it didn't suit her. So she started pinching his cheeks. Queen Fortuna then entered, calling Nina a naive, carefree girl, reminding Nina she only received the gifts in exchange for marriage. Nina wondered if the queen had just dropped some crazy gossip. After Mushulum went to go play outside, Nina decided to be direct with the queen, asking her if she was trying to harm Azure. Nina brought up the fact that Azure would be useful for her son, the future king, as an advisor. The queen scoffed, admitting to the truth of Azure's usefulness, saying that without a doubt, Azure was needed, and that she only simply reminded him not to step above his position. Nina was shocked at the revelation that Queen Fortuna really didn't think of Azure as a nuisance. Nina then brought up Lord Bolge, the man Azure killed who tried to assassinate him. No one had seen Bolge since the Star Festival. However, the queen claimed she'd never associate with him, as he was one of the king's dogs. And that's when King Fortuna appeared behind Nina. In his office, he claimed Lord Bolge went missing while looking for something, and was now asking if she knew anything about it. to which she denied. She could now tell the king was probably trying to get rid of Oz. The king's demeanor here was unusually pretentious. He questioned why she went to see his grandfather the other day. She began to sweat, now knowing he suspected she was an imposter, and he kept playing coy, saying she shouldn't keep secrets from her father. She tried to calm herself, thinking since he was asking, there must be an uncertainty as to whether or not she was an imposter. He then smugly told her the secret about Azure, who was a substitute for the real prince who had died at a young age. It was near the king's birthday celebration. He was in a good mood, until he saw Azure messing with his shatar set. He smacked Azure so violently it killed him. Even while Azure's mother cried over the death of their son, the king took no fault, saying the boy was simply unlucky. He called his servants to bring a child to take Azure's place. That way, his birthday wouldn't get ruined. His grandfather called him a fool, but in the king's mind, if he was a fool, then everything was just as foolish. Nina now realized the absurdity of the king's ego kept hidden from the public. The king laughed, stating his children were merely people who shared blood with him, nothing more than the kingdom's pawns. Still, Nina brought up the fact that Azure would not betray him, and that he just wanted to support the kingdom. The king already knew, though, but was trying to get rid of Azure simply because he hated him. Despite his lack of royal blood, Azure cares for the nation and selflessly devotes himself to it. He was so perfect, it creeped the king out. The king hated the fact that everyone trusted Azure, and that even his own grandfather praised the boy highly. He wondered why must he, the king, be compared to an impostor of the royal family. He thought a pawn should remain a pawn. This nation was his game board to which he ruled. Nina now understood the king was just playing a game. He only cared about his fun and killed out of spite. He kneeled down, snarkily telling Nina to admit she was an imposter. And in this moment, she thought about what she, as Alicia, could do. She desperately wanted to stay with Azure. She wanted him to call her Nina forever, but knew she couldn't be with him. She didn't want him to die. To that end, she would become Alicia. She stood up, speaking now in a confident royal air, telling the king he must be confused, because she was indeed Alicia. The king was now shaking, conflicted on if Lord Bolge had jumped to conclusions. She swore to the god of stars this was her true identity. She was willing to lie to the gods for her goal. She believed God would surely punish her, but she accepted it. She told the king she fully intended to go to Galgada and get married, becoming their queen and the shield that protects Fortuna. And her ace in the hole was her promise to only protect a Fortuna where Azure was still alive. She claimed to have listened to the stars, and that her eyes could see the ends of the world. If Azure were to die under suspicious circumstances, she would lead Galgada and become the sword that destroys Fortuna. The king was taken aback, calling this treason. He told Nina even as his child, he wouldn't let her get away with this. But she reminded him if she died, they'd have no way to keep Galgada in check, and that he was as powerless now as he'd always been. She gracefully bowed out, knowing she'd won this gambit. She then ran outside to Azure, with his protection and freedom in her thoughts. In his room, he offered to give her any books she'd want for reading. Hearing him explain the contents of a picture book, she thought of how his voice was soothing to her ears. She wished she could listen to it forever. He then told her he sent a message to Galgada proposing to postpone her marriage to buy time. But she knew the messenger wouldn't reach the other kingdom. On a previous night, The former king sent one of his messengers to her room. He had known Nina was going down this path all along. She'd leave this nation without telling Oz in order to protect him and never see him again. She then asked Azure to go downtown with her, to show him around where she used to live. She wanted one more memory with him before she was gone. They first went to the marketplace in disguise, where he told her to make sure she kept her eyes hidden. They stopped by a fruit stand that Nina used to steal from all the time, so Azure gave the vendor a gold coin as compensation, paying what she owed. Another vendor offered Azure jewelry for his girlfriend, and Nina's heart was gushing, not hearing him deny it. She began to pout, thinking she shouldn't let her heart sway, knowing they were going to be torn apart. Continuing their walk, Nina learned Azure couldn't remember his original name. She couldn't tell him she wanted to have a special name to call him by. However, he did tell her she was the only one calling him Az, then said her name, making her blush. She then took him to the grave area, bringing up that a boy who was like a younger brother to her was buried here. Since they didn't have money for a doctor, they couldn't take care of his illness. The boy had told her that was the star he was born under. She always hated when people said that. Azure brought up that since Fortna was a wealthy nation, they should be doing more to reduce poverty. He believed they would do it someday. Nina reflected on Azure's golden eyes she saw from the night Saji sold her. They initially terrified her, like the eyes of a beast glowing in the darkness. But now, she saw them as a much kinder color, like the moon illuminating the darkness of the night. She then decided to hug him all of a sudden, catching him off guard. He couldn't take it anymore, and showed her his love with a kiss. She felt warm and weightless, and a tightness in her chest. She wanted to fill her heart with this moment, lock it away, and treasure it forever. She thought it was no fun hearing him say they couldn't go out like this all the time. But then he told her the next time would probably be the Fall Harvest Festival. Hearing this broke her heart, but she told him she was looking forward to it, knowing she wouldn't see him again. She thanked him with a saddened smile, knowing the path she'd chosen. On another day, her maids were in awe seeing her in her Galgadan clothing. She was shocked to learn they were not coming with her. She really would be alone on this journey, all alone, without anyone she knew. She was scared. It felt like the ground was disappearing beneath her feet, and when she reached out, she only found darkness. Mushulam then came crying for his big sister, who was leaving 10 days earlier than planned. She explained the former king made arrangements for this to happen on this day, because Azure was busy and away from the castle. Mushulam didn't want his sister to leave, and she hugged him, telling him not to be selfish, and that she'd watch over Fortna. She promised once she acquired power in Galgada, she'd come back to see him, and he thought the idea to be so scary. Riding with Didas, Azure mentioned something felt off. He went to where he was supposed to handle business, only to learn it was the former king who set this up. Azure felt betrayed by his attendant. He took his horse, rushing back, thinking about how Nina had seemed off to him, and how his messenger suddenly went to inspect the countryside instead of returning. It was all to keep him away. He now realized Nina most likely set this up, and already a substantial distance away from the kingdom. She wondered if Oz would be mad at her by now. Regardless, she couldn't let him stop her. But her tune quickly changed as her eyes welled up. She wished for him to come stop her. She didn't want to go. She wanted to stay with him. She cried, wanting to see him one more time. Guards tried to stop Azure from leaving the kingdom, and he had his horse jump right over them. He was frustrated because he told Nina he would have figured something out. Just for now, Nina swore she'd only cry now, and never again. In Bastia, a city in the Galgada territory. Prince Set shoots and kills Princess Eliza, thinking it was such a shame since she had a wonderful voice. He told the other two not to cower because it would make him think they wanted to kill him just like she did. His attendants then called for him, preparing his outfit, as he was to meet with a princess from Fortna today. But he had no idea who she even was.